Some encounters change lives forever. Others expose truths hiding in plain sight. Margaret Lawson didn't need much from the world these days. At 73 years old, she had lived through enough injustice to recognize it before it even reached her doorstep. She had seen it in the way people locked their car doors when she walked by, in the way store clerks followed her just a little too closely, in the way neighbors glanced out their windows when she strolled down the block in her Sunday best. Some things never changed. But this was different. Margaret had just finished her weekly grocery run at Thompson's Market, one of the few stores in the neighborhood that hadn't been swallowed up by gentrification. The plastic bags dug into her fingers as she walked slowly toward her car, her back aching from years of carrying burdens that were never hers to bear. She had just placed her bags in the trunk when she heard it, a short, clipped whistle, the kind not meant for animals or friends, but for control. "Mum." The voice was firm, expectant. Margaret turned, adjusting her glasses. Two uniformed police officers approached her. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. "Officer Grant." The other was younger, shifting on his feet, like he wasn't sure why they were stopping her. "Officer Riley." "Need to see some ID," Grant said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected instant obedience. Margaret frowned. "Excuse me?" "Just a routine check, Mum," Riley added quickly. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Routine for who? Margaret studied the officers for a moment, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. She had been through this before. Different faces, different uniforms, but always the same script. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "And what exactly does that mean?" Officer Grant squared his shoulders, his lips curling into a smirk. "Just show us some ID and we'll be on our way." Margaret exhaled slowly, suppressing the heat rising in her chest. She had heard those words before. When she was 16 and walking home from church, when she was 35 and pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. "Officer," she said, her voice even, "I'm 73 years old. I just bought groceries from the same store I've been shopping at for decades. What crime exactly do you think I've committed?" Officer Riley shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his partner and Margaret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Grant cut him off. "Mum, we're just doing our job," Grant said, his tone dripping with condescension. Margaret's fingers twitched at her side. "And what job is that, exactly?" The smirk on Grant's face flickered. For the first time there was a brief hesitation, a crack in his confidence. "You refusing to comply?" he asked, his voice just a little sharper. And there it was. The shift, the moment when an interaction turned into an ultimatum, when silence was no longer an option. Margaret inhaled deeply, then reached into her purse, not for her ID, but for something far more powerful. Her phone. Officer Riley tensed as Margaret pulled out her phone, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Officer Grant, however, didn't flinch. If anything, he looked amused. "Who are you calling, ma'am?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She scrolled through her contacts with deliberate patience, refusing to be rushed. "You don't need to make any calls," Grant continued, his smirk widening. "Just show us some ID, and we can all move on." Margaret lifted her gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. "I'll move on when you tell me what crime I've committed." Grant exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "Look, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Just—" The call connected. A voice, sharp and authoritative, came through the speaker. "Ma'am?" A slow smile tugged at the corner of Margaret's lips. She tilted her head slightly, letting her gaze linger on the officers just long enough for doubt to creep into their expressions. "Hello, sweetheart," she said lightly, as if she weren't standing in the middle of a grocery store parking lot being interrogated for simply existing. I seem to be having a little trouble here. The smirk on Grant's face wavered. Margaret lifted a finger, silencing him without a word. Where are you? The voice on the other end demanded, suddenly sharper. Margaret's gaze remained steady on the officers. Outside Thompson's Market. A pause, then a firm response. Stay put. Officer Riley swallowed hard. Grant's jaw tightened. Margaret slipped her phone back into her purse. Oh, I will. Officer Grant's confidence faltered for the first time. His posture stiffened as he exchanged a quick glance with Officer Riley, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. Ma'am, we don't want any trouble, Riley said, his voice quieter now. Let's just... The low hum of an approaching car interrupted him. Not just any car, a sleek black sedan moving fast, coming to a sharp halt just a few feet away. The driver's door swung open and Naomi Lawson stepped out. She was tall, poised, and dressed in a sharp navy moodle suit. The presence she carried was enough to shift the air around them. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to flash a badge. The second she shut the car door, she owned the space. Her dark brown eyes locked onto the officers like a hawk sizing up prey. Which one of you put your hands on my mother? The grocery store parking lot fell into complete silence. Grant immediately took a step back. No one touched her, he said quickly, the confidence in his tone now replaced by something else. Defense. Good, Naomi said, taking a slow step forward. Because if you had, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Riley swallowed hard. The tension in the air was suffocating. Grant, still trying to regain control, spoke up. We didn't know who she was. Naomi's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. I'm sorry, what? Grant hesitated. We didn't know she was your mother. Naomi let the silence stretch. Then her voice turned sharp as steel. So you're saying that if she wasn't my mother, if she were just another black woman, you would have treated her differently? Grant opened his mouth, then shut it. There was no right answer. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered around the parking lot. People who had been quietly watching were now standing still, waiting to see what would happen next. Naomi took another step forward, her presence alone enough to keep the officers frozen in place. You assumed, she continued, her voice steady and measured, you harassed my mother, and now that you realize who she is, you suddenly want to backtrack? Neither officer spoke. Naomi's gaze flickered to Riley, the younger cop who now looked like he wanted to disappear. And you, she said, voice sharp but not unkind, you knew this was wrong, didn't you? Riley hesitated, his throat bobbing. He didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Badge numbers, Naomi demanded. Now. Riley immediately reached for his notepad, scribbling down his information and handing it over. Grant hesitated for a fraction too long. Naomi didn't blink. I will make one phone call, and by sunset your entire precinct will be under scrutiny. Do you really want to test me? Grant's jaw tightened, but he yanked out his badge number and handed it over. Naomi took the papers, barely glancing at them before slipping them into her pocket. Go back to your department, she said, her tone final. Let them know this, she gestured between them, the parking lot, the crowd, is far from over. Grant didn't argue, neither did Riley. Without another word, they turned and walked away. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the officers walked away, the tension in the parking lot didn't fade, it transformed. What had started as a quiet confrontation had now become something much bigger. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse, watching as people slowly stepped forward. Neighbors, shoppers, strangers who had seen everything. Mrs. Lawson, a man in a plaid button-up said, his voice rough with emotion, "We're not letting this slide." A young mother holding her toddler's hand shook her head. This happens too often. If it weren't for your daughter, how would this have ended? Naomi turned to the small crowd, scanning the faces. People were angry, not just about what happened to Margaret, but about what this moment represented. "This isn't new," Naomi said, her voice firm yet steady. "We all know that." She glanced at her mother, then back to the others. "And my mother knows that better than anyone." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We have the media's attention," Naomi continued. "That means we use it. We make sure this story isn't just another headline that fades away." "How?" someone asked. "Show up, speak up, demand accountability. If we don't, they'll keep getting away with it," Naomi said. The energy in the air shifted, no longer just frustration, but action. Margaret, who had spent decades seeing stories like hers disappear into silence, exhaled slowly. This time, it felt different. This time, people were listening. By the time Margaret and Naomi arrived home, the storm had already begun. Naomi's phone buzzed non-stop. News outlets, legal offices, civil rights groups, people who had heard, people who wanted a statement, people who wanted action. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, watching her daughter move through the house like a strategist preparing for battle. Naomi had handled countless cases in her career, but this was personal. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the chaos. Naomi exchanged a glance with her mother before opening it. Standing on the doorstep was Police Chief Michael Graves. His crisp suit and controlled expression did little to hide the tension in his shoulders. "Attorney General Lawson," he greeted, his voice measured. "May I come in?" Naomi folded her arms. "Let's get to it." Chief Graves sighed, stepping inside. "I want to personally apologize for what happened to your mother." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly are you apologizing for?" The chief hesitated. "For the way my officers treated you." Naomi's expression didn't change. "And how do you think they treated her?" Graves cleared his throat. "I reviewed the footage. It was unacceptable." Naomi leaned in slightly. "And what happens next?" Graves hesitated again. "The officers have been placed on leave. Paid for now." Naomi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That's not enough." She didn't just want a pause. She wanted change. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. This story is more than just a confrontation between a citizen and the police. It's a reflection of systemic bias, power dynamics, and the urgent need for reform in the American legal system. Margaret Lawson is not the first person to be targeted by police misconduct, but because her daughter, Naomi Lawson, the U.S. Attorney General, holds a position of power, her story didn't fade into silence. The most significant moment in the story is the shift in power. The officers started in full control of the situation, but the second Naomi arrived, they were forced to answer for their actions. The moment Grant said he didn't know Margaret was Naomi's mother exposed the system itself. Police officers behave differently when they realize the person they're targeting has connections. However, the real issue isn't that Margaret had a powerful daughter. The issue is that the system should protect all citizens equally, regardless of who they know. This is a story about justice, accountability, and breaking cycles of systemic discrimination. Lessons from the story. 1. Power can shift the balance of justice, but justice should not depend on power. Margaret only received fair treatment once the officers learned she was related to someone in power. This raises the question, what would have happened if she didn't have Naomi? Justice should not be reserved for the well-connected. 2. Racial profiling still exists in law enforcement. Margaret did nothing wrong, yet she was stopped and harassed simply because of the color of her skin. This reflects a harsh reality. Many Black Americans still face discrimination for merely existing. 3. Communities hold incredible power when they stand together. It wasn't just Naomi who stood up, it was the entire community that refused to stay silent. Collective outrage creates pressure that forces the system to change. When people unite against injustice, no one is left behind. 4. Change doesn't happen without a fight. Naomi didn't just want the officers suspended, she wanted real consequences and systemic reform. If she hadn't pushed back, this incident would have been buried like thousands of others. Change only happens when people demand answers, refuse to accept half measures, and fight for real accountability. 5. Justice should not be a privilege, it should be a right. The fact that Naomi had to leverage her power to ensure her mother was treated fairly is a contradiction. If the system were truly just, anyone should be able to demand justice without needing connections to someone in authority. The most important message: we cannot rely on people in power to fix injustice. We must be part of the change. If we stay silent and passive, stories like Margaret's will keep happening without consequences. A question for the readers: if you were a witness to this situation, what would you do? Would you speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments.